The rent was due on Friday, the same day as wages. Not a coincidence. Not an administrative oversight. A design feature. The kind that does not appear in the company's public literature but shows up, with regularity, in the payroll and rent ledgers of company towns across the American industrial landscape between 1880 and 1935. The worker received wages on Friday. The company collected rent on Friday. What remained after rent, what the worker actually took home, was the wage minus the housing cost, minus the company store tab, if he had run one, minus any deductions the company had determined were appropriate that week. The net figure was whatever the company calculated it to be. At its peak, the company town system housed an estimated 3 million American workers and their families across the coal fields of Appalachia, the steel towns of Pennsylvania, the textile mills of the Carolinas, the copper mines of Arizona and Montana, the lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest. These were not temporary arrangements. Many company towns operated for decades. Some ran for half a century. The workers who lived in them were not transients. They were families, with children in company schools, worshiping in company churches, buying from company stores, treated by company doctors, buried in company cemeteries. Every institution of daily life was owned by the same entity that owned the workers' labor. That was not an accident of geography. It was a system. And the records of how it worked are more specific than the history of it suggests. Here is what the system actually looked like from inside the ledger. The company town model was not invented by a single industry or a single operator. It emerged across the second half of the 19th century as a solution to a specific logistical problem: how to staff a productive operation in a location where no existing labor market or housing supply existed. A coal seam in a West Virginia hollow, a copper deposit in an Arizona canyon, a textile mill site on a Carolina river. These were places where workers had to be recruited, transported, and housed before production could begin. The company that built the mine or the mill built the town because there was no town to build next to. The logic was operational before it was exploitative. The earliest company towns were genuinely necessary. Without them, the labor force could not have been assembled and retained. What the archive shows is how a system built out of logistical necessity became, over time, a system of economic control that operated well beyond what necessity required. The scrip system is where the control becomes most precisely documented. Many company towns paid wages, in whole or in part, in scrip. A company-issued currency that could be redeemed only at company-owned establishments. The scrip had no value outside the company's commercial infrastructure. A worker paid in scrip could buy at the company store, pay company rent, use company services. He could not take his earnings to a competing merchant, a different landlord, or a bank that was not the company's own. The legal status of scrip was contested throughout the period. Several states passed laws restricting or prohibiting its use. The enforcement of those laws was not uniform. Company towns operated in remote locations where state labor inspectors rarely appeared, where the local sheriff was frequently a company employee, and where the workers most affected by scrip payment had no practical access to legal remedy. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters. Because the experience of being paid in a currency that can only be spent in one place, at prices set by the entity that issued the currency, is not a condition that requires a 19th century coal mine to recognize. It is the operational description of any system in which the employer controls not only the wage, but the price of everything the wage must purchase. The geography changes. The mechanism does not. The Pullman case is the one the historical record documents most completely, because it ended in a strike, a federal intervention, and a congressional investigation that generated thousands of pages of testimony. George Pullman built his model town south of Chicago in the 1880s as a deliberate showcase, a demonstration that a well-designed company town could produce a contented, productive workforce without the disorder of the open city. The town was architecturally coherent, sanitary by the standards of the period, and genuinely superior in its physical infrastructure to the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago that Pullman workers might otherwise have inhabited. It was also completely controlled. Pullman owned every building, set every rent, operated the water system, the gas supply, the church, the library, the hotel, the market. No saloons were permitted. Pullman's personal preference encoded into the town's physical design. No organizations that Pullman did not sanction could meet on Pullman property. Maybe the Pullman model was exactly what its creator claimed: a genuine attempt to provide workers with superior living conditions while maintaining the order necessary for a productive enterprise. If this were the whole picture, Pullman would be a paternalistic but defensible experiment in industrial urbanism. But the 1894 strike record refuses to stay that charitable. When the economic depression of 1893 forced Pullman to cut wages by an average of 25% across the workforce, he did not cut rents. The workers' income fell. Their housing costs did not. The gap between what they earned and what they owed the company for the basic conditions of their existence widened at the precise moment when widening it was most damaging. Archival patterns from the congressional investigation that followed the 1894 strike document worker testimony describing a situation in which, after rent and store deductions, some workers received paychecks from the Pullman Company for amounts less than $1 for a full week of labor. In at least one documented case, a worker received a paycheck for 2 cents. The 2-cent paycheck is in the congressional record. The Strike Commission report is where the system stops being abstract. The United States Strike Commission was convened by President Cleveland in the aftermath of the Pullman strike of 1894, one of the largest and most disruptive labor actions in American history, which had paralyzed rail traffic across 27 states before federal troops intervened to break it. The commission took testimony from workers, managers, Pullman Company executives, and railroad operators. Its report, submitted to Congress in November 1894, is in the public record. It is accessible. It has been read by historians for over a century. What those accounts less consistently foreground is what the commission concluded about the company-town system itself. Not about the strike, not about the intervention, but about the structural relationship between employer and worker that the Pullman model had created. The commission's language was not neutral. It described the Pullman system as one in which the company's ownership of every element of the worker's domestic life created a dependency that made genuine labor negotiation impossible. A worker who owed rent to his employer, who bought food from his employer, whose children attended schools owned by his employer, was not in a position to withhold his labor without simultaneously losing his housing, his food supply, and his children's schooling. The strike was not merely an industrial action. It was an attempt to exit a total system, and the total system had been designed so that exit was not a viable option. The commission recommended legislative action to restrict the company-town model. The recommendation is in the report. It was not acted upon. The commission saw the system clearly. Congress read the report and moved on. And here is where the archive produces its most specific detail. the one that the celebratory accounts of American industrial history most consistently omit. The company store markup is documented. Not inferred, not estimated. Documented in the records of state labor bureaus that conducted price surveys in company towns during the 1890s and early 1900s. Those surveys compared prices at company stores with prices at independent merchants in nearby towns for identical goods. The markups they found on flour, on salt pork, on lamp oil, on the basic commodities of working-class domestic life, ran, in documented cases, from 15 to 40% above the prices available in the open market. The worker who was paid in scrip redeemable only at the company store was not merely captive to a single vendor. He was paying a captivity premium, a surcharge on every purchase that the system of scrip and geographic isolation made impossible to avoid. If this investigation is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next one follows a different system of economic capture, one where the mechanism is less visible than a company store, and the ledger that documents it is in a federal archive that very few people have looked at directly. The legal dismantling of the company town system happened in stages, through the anti-scrip legislation that several states eventually enforced, through the labor organizing that the New Deal made more viable, and finally through a 1946 Supreme Court decision, Marsh v. Alabama, that established that company towns could not suppress free speech and assembly in the same way private property ordinarily could. By 1950, the classic company town, the total environment, the scrip wage, the rent-on-payday system had largely disappeared from the American industrial landscape. The mines and mills that had depended on it either closed, unionized, or transitioned to cash wages and open housing markets. What did not disappear was the underlying logic, the geographic isolation that had made the company town possible, the fact that a worker's only viable employment was the same entity as his only viable landlord and his only viable merchant, did not require a company town to reproduce itself. It required only a labor market thin enough and a housing market controlled enough that the effective choice available to a worker was not meaningfully different from what it had been in Pullman in 1893. Archival patterns suggest the Commission's 1894 recommendation that the structural relationship between employer control of housing and employer control of labor required specific legislative remedy was never enacted at the federal level. The recommendation sat in the report. The report sat in the congressional record. The 2-cent paycheck was documented. The remedy was not. The company towns are gone. The logic is not. The specific mechanism, scrip, company store, rent on payday, required a degree of geographic isolation that the post-war American economy gradually eroded. Highways, automobiles, union contracts with cash wage requirements, federal housing programs that expanded the rental market beyond employer control, all of these reduced the conditions under which total employer capture of a worker's domestic life was operationally sustainable. What they did not reduce was the underlying question the 1894 Strike Commission had identified and Congress had declined to answer. At what point does an employer's control over the conditions of a worker's life outside the workplace constitute a labor relations problem rather than a property rights matter? That question appears, in different forms, in contemporary debates about employer-provided housing in agricultural labor camps, about company-owned worker dormitories in technology manufacturing, about the relationship between employer-sponsored health insurance and worker mobility, about the dynamics of single-employer towns where the largest employer is also the largest landlord and the largest donor to local government. The geography has changed. The Commission's question has not been answered. The Pullman Company was dissolved in 1898, 4 years after the strike. The town of Pullman was annexed by Chicago in 1889, before the strike, while the model was still being celebrated. The brick row houses are still there, designated a National Historic Landmark in 2015. The 2-cent paycheck is still in the congressional record. The system was documented. The question it raised is still open.